Hello and welcome back to the Extended Bench. This week we're looking at why the NRL average age is getting older. So if we go back to 2020, then the career of the NRL's longest player came to an end in Cameron Smith. And since then we've had Benji Marshall, Sia Soliola, the Morris twins, and even Blake Green retire, which means that we've only got two players that debuted in the 2000s still playing in the NRL, and that's Jared Warrior-Hargreaves and Ben Hunt. We now have a completely second generation of players that are full-time professionals. None of the current players debuted before the invention of the National Youth Competition, which occurred in 2008, and many of them will be hard-pressed to remember the full careers of players like Andrew Johns and Shane Webke. One of the interesting things to look at is the way you break down squad ages. In some respects, they've remained pretty consistent for the past 10 to 15 years, but in others, they're getting older, or in some cases, they're getting younger. It seems that forwards are getting younger, whereas backs are pretty stagnant. And while the NRL itself remains a young man's game, there's certainly a place for older players. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Now, I'm going to start here with a big thank you to the Rugby League Eye Test, who crunched these numbers and posted a breakdown of player ages from round one for the past 10 years. I'll link to it below in the description so you can take a look at their article. Please give it a good read. The Rugby League Eye Test does fantastic work and it's all free, and you can make a donation there if you wish. But as I said, all of their work is free. So if you look at that data, the average round one age for every NRL team has remained pretty stagnant for the past decade. The average age hasn't crept above 26.3 years. Then if you look at the backs, they've hardly moved at all. But for the forwards, they've dropped nearly a full year across the decade, which seems to be a little bit rare. The general consensus is that forwards don't really come into their own until their late 20s, when their bodies are physically matured and they've perhaps got through some of those injuries early in their career due to the size of the bodies that they have and the collisions that they're involved in an NRL game. However, the biggest drop in age has come on the bench. They have dropped a full year in the past decade. Whereas the bench, you quite often, might use an older player here or there as an experienced head to come on the field. Teams are very much looking to use their bench to field their young players. There's probably a couple of reasons for this. And first off, we have COVID. Of course, with the COVID rules that gave us rugby league on steroids, you couldn't really use older players. Their legs went too early in the game. And so you had to use the younger guys who could keep up with the new rules and the fact that you had very few stoppages throughout games. But the Rugby League Eye Test wasn't the first person to look at this. In 2015, Vincent Kelly published a piece on the conversation looking at average ages in NRL squads. And he was actually trying to predict that year's grand final winner. Now, he did incorrectly predict Melbourne, but he was pretty close on some of the other predictions that he had. Interestingly, he actually went against the bookmakers who had backed the Roosters, and ultimately the Cowboys won the premiership, and they did so with the oldest average age in the NRL, and that was bested the following year by the Cronulla Sharks with the virtual Dad's Army. But so far, we've looked at kind of very small snapshots of teams, age ranges, and when those ages matter. So the Rugby League Eye Test was looking at average squad ages during round one, while Vincent Kelly was looking at it from a one-season perspective and then trying to predict the outcome of the NRL Premiership. But I want to look at it over the past 20 years, so starting in 2003 to the 2023 season. So we're going to take the average ages of all the players and all the teams and see how it's been tracking for the past 2 decades. So if we rewind to 2003, when YouTube didn't exist, Facebook didn't exist, Twitter didn't exist, or X if you want to call it that, then the average age of an NRL player across a full season in the NRL was 23. In 2023, that average age had risen to 25. Now, of course, outliers exist, and these age ranges can be impacted by the presence of teenagers playing 1 or 2 games a season as they get slowly blooded into the NRL. For instance, it's much easier to see an 18 or 19-year-old given a debut at the end of a season and play 1 or 2 games, as opposed to a 30-year-old only playing 1 or 2 games. But the average stats then, give equal weighting to those 2 different age ranges, despite the fact one had a much bigger impact on their team's chances of success than the other. So we can look at that, and in fact in 2003 there were 43 teenagers who played at least one game in the NRL that year. Fast forward to 2021 and that total number had dropped to 25, and it had dropped even further in 2023. By 2023 there were only 15 teenagers in the NRL. Interestingly, across that entire period we've seen a dramatic drop in the number of teenagers playing in the NRL, while the number of players being used by sides throughout a season has steadily risen. There's probably a couple of reasons, and the first is that we've had increased squad sizes. In the early 2000s, NRL squads could only contain 25 players, and then you had the second tier system, which was outdated and farcical at best. Now you have a squad of 30 players, and you can also include development players, and in 2024 those development players will be available for the full season. We've also now got a minimum age limit of 18, so gone are the days of 16 and 17-year-old players bursting on the scene, unless you're the Roosters, which in that case you can ask for special dispensation from the NRL and then lose that player a couple of years later to rugby union. And across those past 20 years, we've seen massive improvements in sports science and the way that players recover and prepare for matches. So those teenagers are a lot different physically to those players that are in their early 20s already due to physical development. And it takes a really rare teenager to be able to crack it in the NRL consistently when they debut. There's also the ability for careers to be prolonged beyond very serious injuries, and we've seen advancements in the way that ACL tears are treated as well as Achilles ruptures. And whilst those are still very serious injuries, they're no longer, on the whole, career enders. They can be treated pretty well by sports medicine and the way that they are put through recovery programs by their teams. And even players that have had 2 or 3 ACL ruptures can continue to have quite a good NRL career. You only have to look at Clint Gutherson to see that. Another way to look at this is the actual age of an NRL player peaked in 2018 at 25.31 years. Now, of course, 2018 was also the year we had the rules crackdown, which saw multiple penalties awarded per match as the NRL decided that teams infringing even a little bit had to be penalised. Now, of course, you have more stoppages in a game like that with players able to catch their breath, so it kind of makes sense that the older players whose legs may not be able to keep up with the 2023 or 2024 version of the game could do so back in 2018. And of course, since 2018, the average age has dropped. In 2021, it dropped below 25 years of age. And that was the first time in over a decade that the average NRL age had dropped. Interestingly though, the average age is starting to head north again. Ever since 2021 and the basically NRL on steroids that we had back then, the average age has started to head north, with teams opting for older, more experienced players. Despite that average age actually going up, the number of players that are over the age of 30 hasn't really changed in the past 3 years. In 2021, we had 69 players aged over 30 during the NRL season, and in 2023, we had 68 players. So what's that indicating? Well, we've had fewer teenagers debut recently. However, the number of players over 30 has remained stagnant. So that's indicating that those players who debut in their 20s are remaining in the NRL, and everything's kind of remaining fairly consistent in terms of the number of players debuting every year. So we're getting a slightly older age group as a whole without the massive number of outliers that you saw in 2003 when there were well over 40 teenagers. The NRL is always going to remain a young man's game. 25 is not old by any stretch of the imagination. But it is interesting to see that after it peaked in 2018 and dropped off again, that it's now starting to go back up. I mean, could it be that advances in technology and continued advances in sports medicine and sports science means that players can play more often and can play further into their 30s as they learn to recover better and to look after their bodies better? And while the game is played at a completely different speed to what it was 20 years ago, there are always different trade-offs in those facets of the game where we're seeing things starting to settle down as the NRL referees, players and coaches understand how to utilize and to interact with things like the set restarts and penalties and shots at goal and penalties for this and penalties for that. There's always going to be a place in the NRL for those more experienced players. And perhaps the thing that we should be looking at isn't so much the age range of playing groups, but more so the number of games that they've played. And while a lot's been made recently about Penrith playing 4 grand finals in a row and winning 3 of them, throughout that time, they've had many players enter the 100 games club for Penrith, or, in some cases, well over 200 games in the NRL. And ultimately, it's experience in the top grade that tends to be the difference between teams, not so much the age group of the players. If you like that video or you're keen to check out more, please visit the Extended Bench YouTube channel and click subscribe. You can also like this video, give us a thumbs up, it really helps the channel. I'll be back next week. I'm actually going to be looking at a breakdown of the Panthers and Broncos grand final and what the hell actually happened there. Was it the Broncos losing the grand final, or was it Penrith winning it? So until next time, bye for now.